Testing 1, 2. Testing, testing.
Yeah.
You're like, I know the routine.
Yeah. Good morning. The committee will come to order. We meet today to consider H.R. 1745. Last Friday, we received the April unemployment numbers, and while there was some good news about the number of jobs being created, the fact is the nation's unemployment rate ticked back up to 9%. In my home state of Michigan, we're perilously close to 3 straight years of unemployment rates in double digits. And during this recession, a record of up to 99 weeks of unemployment benefits have been paid per person. Of those weeks, 73 weeks have been the full responsibility of the federal government. With a single exception, every one of the 9 bills since June of 2008 providing these benefits simply added to our deficits by a whopping total of $180 billion. Worse yet, this deficit spending has been poorly targeted, adding insult to already injured taxpayers. A total of 70% of this federal spending has gone to states regardless of how low their unemployment rate is. For example, in North Dakota, the unemployment rate is 3.7%, yet the unemployed can collect 60 weeks of benefits, more than a year, including 34 weeks paid 100% by the federal government. Some argued that these benefits would increase economic activity and employment, but the only increase we've seen is an increase in unemployment taxes. And while federal tax rates are starting to rise in some states, including my home state of Michigan, the real concern involves what's going on at the state level. As a result of the recession, but also federal policies, state unemployment taxes on jobs have already risen by 44% in the past 2 years, with more tax hikes ahead. And employers in 22 states will see their federal unemployment taxes go up this year. Let's be clear, we all want to help those who have been affected by the recession move from collecting an unemployment check to earning a paycheck. But we can't do that if we're taxing the very men and women we're counting on to help create the jobs that so many are seeking. Unemployment taxes are payroll taxes on jobs, plain and simple. And as they grow, these taxes on jobs are only making it harder for the millions of unemployed workers to get back to work. Clearly, the unemployment program is in need of reform, and that is what the bill before us today starts to do. The solution we're proposing today in the Jobs Act can be boiled down to these 2 concepts: reform and forward funding. The goal is equally simple to understand: help the unemployed by making it more likely they can find a job and get back on their feet. First and foremost, the Jobs Act makes long overdue reforms to the permanent unemployment benefits program. These include minimum job search standards and expecting those most likely to exhaust the benefits without finding work, such as people without a high school degree, to get the education or training they need to improve their chances of finding work. Unemployment benefits are temporary and designed to help people return to work. These reforms strengthen that core purpose. We also allow states more flexibility to test innovative strategies to help the unemployed return to work, including through wage subsidies and other innovative approaches that have received bipartisan support. Similar reforms were made in the historic and successful welfare reforms of the 1990s, which expected states to do more to help low-income parents get the education and training they need, search for work, and ultimately take a job. Unemployed workers deserve no less help today. The second core feature of the Jobs Act involves forward funding the remaining federal unemployment funds for this year so that governors, in conjunction with state legislatures, have the flexibility to best meet the needs of the people in their states. Through the end of this year, an estimated $31 billion in temporary federal unemployment funds will be paid by Washington. In granting governors and state legislatures new authority over these funds within the confines of their unemployment programs, they will have the ability to pay regular or extended unemployment benefits, prevent unemployment tax hikes on employers, pay interest or principal on federal unemployment loans, and promote job creation and hiring through the use of reemployment services, including wage subsidies. And I want to be clear about one point, since I'm sure we'll hear a great deal about it today. Federal benefits would remain guaranteed unless the states decided there is a better way to spend this money to help the unemployed. States can continue to pay up to 99 weeks of benefits if that's what they choose to do. In fact, absent state action, that is exactly what will happen. However, where it makes sense to do something else to help the unemployed with the money, states will have the flexibility to make changes that better meet the need of their constituents within the bounds of the unemployment benefits system. And in some states, that could even include providing additional weeks of benefits beyond what is currently authorized. Before I close, I'd like to make two final comments on the legislation before us. It does not add one dime to the federal deficit. My preliminary discussions with CBO suggest there are some small savings under the bill. However, per regular order, CBO will provide us with a final score following today's markup and will make that available to all members as well as the public. Also, staff has identified a technical detail that needs to be fixed to ensure every state can continue operating current unemployment programs. The issue involves state laws citing certain sections of the federal code. Mr. Davis, the chairman of the Human Resources Subcommittee, will have an amendment to address this matter, and it is one I hope will receive unanimous support among the committee members. I now yield to the ranking member for any statement he wishes to make, and without objection, the opening statement of any member wishing to submit one will be made part of the record. Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Calling this a jobs bill is a cruel hoax for the millions of Americans who could see their unemployment benefits disappear while seeing no new job opportunities. This callous legislation would end the guarantee of federal unemployment insurance for 4 million Americans, just like Republicans want to end the guarantee of Medicare. You Republicans act like the problem is the unemployed. No, the basic problem is the lack of jobs. Nearly 9 million jobs were lost during this recession. We've gained about 2 million private sector jobs in the last 14 months, but not yet enough to compensate for the damage done. Let me just show you some charts. 13.7 million unemployed workers, but only 3.1 million job vacancies, 4.4 workers for every job opening. Unemployment insurance is a lifeline for the unemployed and for their families as they seek work. And for those who think it's a life of luxury, consider Chart 2. The average weekly wage is $784 for all American workers. The poverty level for a family of four is $429 a week. The average unemployment benefit in this country is $300 a week. These benefits are certainly not enough to keep people from taking a job. The Republican plan takes $31 billion from unemployed workers and throws it to the states. Allowing them, as Chart 3 shows, to cut taxes on business, to repay their loans to the federal government, or fill in other budget cuts. Just last December, not a single Republican member of this committee who was in Congress voted against extending federal emergency unemployment insurance for 1 year. Not a single one of you. And now we're not even halfway into this year, and you are already reneging on that vote. I yield the balance of my time to the ranking member, Mr. Doggett.
Well, indeed, last December there was a great, if temporary, kumbaya moment between President Obama and the Republicans. The Republicans said, give us our tax breaks for billionaires for another 2 years, and we'll extend unemployment assistance to the most desperately unemployed for 1 year. And it's not 5 months later, and they've decided they still want to help the billionaires, but they're not so sure. Maybe we'll have an opt-out for helping the unemployed. This really is a disappointing moment in the life of the committee this year. We've had a completely bipartisan effort in our subcommittee on human resources. Incorporated in this legislation are some of the bipartisan matters we've talked about, like better data sharing. I personally have no objection to uniform work search requirements, but these bipartisan matters don't represent the thrust of this legislation. This is a bill that represents a surprise attack on the jobless by encouraging the states to terminate assistance to as many as 4 million long-term unemployed Americans. Last Thursday, the proposal on terminating extended employment insurance coverage was sprung on us, jumping out like a jack-in-the-box. And at least Mr. Camp and Mr. Davis were candid that not only had our subcommittee never explored this proposal, but they personally hadn't conceived of it until last week. This bill that has been described to us last Thursday is not the bill that they actually filed. The manager's amendment attempts to return to that proposal. This is what appears to be a sudden, ideologically driven proposal to provide more federal money to the states if they will accept it, combined with the feeling that really the problem is not unemployment but the unemployed. Like the rest of the Republican legislative agenda, this mislabeled Jobs Act does not create a single new job. It simply attempts to take from the jobless. We believe that a better approach would be a bipartisan effort aimed at job training, the very type of job training that the Republican proposal H.R. 1 sought to largely eliminate, and on modernizing our employment system, but not on one that takes from those who need the assistance the most. And I yield back.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 1745. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Matt Whitinger, Staff Director for the Subcommittee on Human Resources, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. I would ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Whitinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Title I of the Chairman's Amendment provides for reforms of unemployment benefits to promote work and job creation. Section 101 creates a basic set of job search requirements for individuals collecting unemployment benefits, as Mr. Doggett just mentioned, ensuring that all are actively seeking work, have registered for employment services, have posted resumes, and have otherwise applied for work similar to what they have previously performed. The requirements are generally the same as those that apply currently under the current law extended benefits program that is payable in present fashion at the end of somebody's period of benefits. This would move that forward. The Chairman's amendment extends the time that states would have to pass laws implementing this provision so that it would take effect after the next regularly scheduled session of the state's legislature. Section 102 requires unemployment benefit recipients who lack a high school diploma to be making progress toward a GED. The Chairman's amendment allows a state to waive this requirement if it would be unduly burdensome in individual cases. The provision also expects individuals who have otherwise been referred to reemployment services by the state to participate in those services to qualify for benefits. The Chairman's amendment again extends the time for states to pass laws so it will be effective after the next regularly scheduled session of their legislature. Section 103 allows states to apply for cost-neutral waivers of federal unemployment law so they can test innovative strategies to promote more and faster reemployment of unemployed workers. This waiver authority is modeled after similar authority provided under other committee programs such as welfare and child welfare. States must apply to the Secretary, describe their plan, provide assurances that the program will be cost neutral, and describe how the demonstration will be evaluated. The provision is effective on the date of enactment. Section 104 repeals a September 2010 Department of Labor regulation that starting in 2014 could force states to raise unemployment taxes even more than under current law in order to qualify for certain federal loan funds in the future. This section is effective after the day of enactment, but again applies to future years. Section 105 provides additional state flexibility to improve unemployment program solvency, repealing a provision that since the 2009 stimulus law has blocked states that want to improve solvency by reducing state unemployment benefits while still receiving federal extended benefit funds. The provision being repealed has to date left states no choice but to raise taxes if they want to improve unemployment program solvency. The provision is effective on the date of enactment. Section 106 creates standardized data elements, again, as Mr. Doggett mentioned, designed to improve the administration of the UI program and also to improve future data matching between UI and other programs. There's some technical changes made involving terms in the Chairman's amendment, and the provision would be effective in October of 2012. Section 107 would replace a current option for states to reduce unemployment benefits in order to recover past unemployment benefit overpayments with a requirement that they do so. Again, it would be effective after the next regular meeting of the state's legislature. Title II provides forward funding of remaining federal unemployment benefit funds available under temporary federal law. Mr. Chairman, you asked me to review sort of the current regime of federal benefits in this case. Just to be clear, this title generally doesn't affect state benefits. In almost all states, currently up to 26 weeks of unemployment benefits are payable today. There are two exceptions, and they currently are Montana and Massachusetts that provide 28 and 30 weeks of regular state benefits. Since 2008, the federal government has operated a temporary emergency program that pays extended benefits for individuals who exhaust those first 26 weeks of regular state benefits. That program started out providing up to 13 weeks in all states, and then has been expanded in a series of laws enacted since 2008. Currently, this program provides up to 53 weeks of 100% federally funded benefits, pays those benefits in what are called tiers, and is currently authorized through December of this year. The first tier pays up to 20 weeks of benefits in all states, regardless of their unemployment rate. The second tier pays another 14 weeks of unemployment benefits in all states, again, regardless of their unemployment rate. The third tier pays up to 13 more weeks of benefits if the individual exhausted those prior tiers and lives in a state with an unemployment rate of 6% or higher. The fourth and final tier of this specific program pays for up to 6 final weeks of benefits in states with an unemployment rate of 8.5% or higher. The federal government actually operates a second extended benefits program under current law. It too uses a system of tiers and unemployment rate triggers. It's called simply the Extended Benefits Program. It's been permanently in the federal law since 1970. It's currently 100% federally funded, as distinct from its prior authorization when it was 50% federally funded. The EB program pays up to 13 weeks of benefits in states that have a 6.5% or higher unemployment rate, and an additional 7 weeks of benefits in states that have an 8% or higher unemployment rate. Bottom line of all this is that across both state and these two federal programs, a total of 99 weeks of unemployment benefits are payable today in states generally with unemployment rates of 8.5% or higher. That's below the national average of 9%, and in no state is less than 60 weeks of total benefits, combining the state and federal benefits payable, regardless of how low their unemployment rate is. Those 60 weeks are actually more in those low unemployment benefit states today than have been paid in prior instances in the highest unemployment states when these sorts of programs were operating. A key purpose of this bill is to provide states more flexibility over the funding of this current regime involving these two separate federal programs, the 6 tiers, and all the unemployment rate triggers, so that states can better and more appropriately target benefits to unemployed individuals in their state or otherwise, or who are otherwise use the money already committed in terms of federal funding to help more people get back to work sooner. Section 201 of the bill provides for special transfers to all the states. It forward funds to state unemployment accounts the expected $31 billion in remaining temporary federal unemployment funds that would be payable under current law. The funds will be provided in fiscal year 2011, $12.8 billion within 10 days of enactment, and in fiscal 2012, $18.2 billion transferred between October 1st and October 10th of 2011. State shares will equal their share of federal unemployment benefit spending in the most recent 12 months. The Chairman's amendment requires states to spend these funds to either pay current federal unemployment benefits or, as specified by a state law passed after enactment, for regular or extended unemployment benefits that might differ from the current federal regime, to repay federal unemployment loans or interest on those loans, or for reemployment services such as wage subsidies, job search assistance, or other services designed to promote rapid reemployment. Chairman's amendment makes several clarifying changes designed to make it clear that if states do not pass laws making changes, these funds can only be spent on extended benefits as authorized under current federal law and state agreements. This provision is effective on the date of enactment. Section 202 provides transition rules for one of those federal programs, the Emergency Unemployment Compensation Program. In effect, since the previous section forward funds to all states their expected share of remaining federal EUC program funds that are payable for the remainder of that program, this section shuts down the current monthly payment system used by that program, among other related changes. Current payments to states, which would be replaced by the forward funding described in the previous section, would end effective for weeks ending after July 6, 2011. Section 203, provides for similar transition rules for the second federal program, the Extended Benefits Program. Again, since Section 201 forward funds to all states their expected shares of remaining federal EB funds associated with temporary expansions of that program, this section repeals those temporary expansions. The Chairman's amendment includes what is titled a savings provision designed to ensure that benefits under this program continue to be paid, including in states whose laws specify that the program will only operate when those temporary expansions are in effect. In general, these provisions are effective in July of 2011 as states start to receive the remaining funds associated with temporary benefit expansions. Section 204 is an emergency designation required because the underlying provision amended in Title II originally carried an emergency designation. Because it amends the purposes for which funds payable under those provisions may be spent, the Jobs Act also needs to carry an emergency designation. Mr. Chairman, that completes my walkthrough.
Thank you, Mr. Weininger. In addition to staff, Ms. Gay Gilbert with the Department of Labor is also here to answer any questions members may have. Are there any questions? I see Mr. Teaberry is seeking recognition for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Weidinger, in your description, it kind of got me thinking about my dad in the early 80s lost his job of 25 years. He lost his pension, he lost his health care. My recollection was, at that time of high unemployment and high interest rates, his unemployment insurance lasted 26 weeks. Was there any time before 2008, based upon what you just talked about, where unemployment insurance was given to individuals who were unemployed longer than 26 weeks?
In the wake of recessions, the Congress has repeatedly created temporary extended benefits programs comparable to the EUC program, the emergency program that I described. Those programs, for example, in the period between 2002 and 2004, provided as much as 26 weeks of benefits under that program. Under current law, 53 weeks of benefits are payable under a comparable program. When those special emergency programs are not operating, there is, as I mentioned, a permanent law extended benefits program, but that program is typically 50% state funded. So states have to make decisions about whether to operate that program, including using state funds for that. So going back to 1970, in general, states decide how many weeks of regular state benefits to pay, and then there's that permanent law extended benefits program, but it's 50-50 federal state funded, which means it may or may not be operating and includes triggers based on unemployment rates. So the bottom line in answer to your question is, there has never been a time where a 100% federally funded program, like these two programs are today, have paid up to 73 weeks of federal benefits.
And that began in?
There have been previous instances, and they have typically paid for as many as 26 weeks of federal benefits.
And that began in 2008, 2009? 73 weeks.
The 73, the ball was kicked off in effect in 2008, and Congress passed a series of laws. In fact, passed a total of 9 laws, either creating or expanding these federal extended benefits programs since June of 2008.
And if we do nothing, if this bill doesn't become law, what happens to federal unemployment taxes at the federal and the state level?
Right. If nothing happens, several things are sure to occur. For example, states will be required to pay interest on the loans that they've taken. Some states, Chairman, I believe...
Beginning in?
Well, in effect, they've already begun, but they would have to make payments by the end of September. So almost immediately, states would have to have special state laws that would pay for that insurance by raising state taxes. The Chairman's amendment provides the states funding and then the flexibility to decide to use this money to relieve some of those tax hikes associated with the interest and also pay down the principal. Separately, the states could use this money if they wish to pay for regular unemployment benefits if they decided that the current regime of federal extended benefits didn't make sense or didn't entirely make sense and they wanted to use some of the money differently. That might relieve them of some regular state unemployment benefit taxes. So what this gives the states is the wherewithal to make decisions over this money that might include things that result in reductions in taxes,
At the federal,
generally at the state level.
but the federal loan
That's right.
repayment is
That's
the
right.
other option as well.
That's right.
Ms. Gilbert, in the president's proposal within his budget, he takes a different tact on this. The concern that I have, if you could address from what I have been told by employers in my state of Ohio, which is another state that's been hit hard by the recession, where we've lost 400,000 jobs in the last 4 years. There's immediate relief, but my understanding is employers then will have to pay higher taxes at a later date. Is that correct?
There are two pieces to the president's proposal. As you mentioned, there is immediate relief to states and employers with regard to the interest payments that would begin to be due this September for a period of 2 years, as well as relief from the reduction in the FUTA tax credit reductions that cause higher employer taxes as well. So relief on both of those fronts. And also, it provides for raising the taxable wage base in 2014, as well as reducing the FUTA tax rate, which actually in 2014 would not actually overall increase employer taxes at that point.
So where does the
So
money
there's
where does the money come from for the immediate relief?
The combination of the bill as a whole is essentially revenue neutral in 2014.
But where does the money come from for the relief? Is it borrowed?
It comes from, it simply means that they do not have to pay their interest at this point. So there is not a cost currently, we just do not receive the revenue.
So there's no CBO cost to this? Congressional Budget Office cost?
It's revenue neutrality in 2014. We could get you a more complete
Yeah, that would be
assessment
great.
of the analysis of the cost of the bill.
That'd be great. Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Gilbert, has that proposal been introduced in the House of Representatives?
Senator Durbin, no.
In the House?
No.
Okay,
no.
thank you. Mr. Levin's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Tiberi, you voted to extend for 1 year, and you're now reneging. You surely are. Mr. Weidinger, if the states wanted to, they could use none of this money for emergency unemployment benefits, right? Yes or no?
If the states passed a law, they could. Yeah.
Could you turn on your microphone? Thank you.
I apologize, Mr. Chairman. The answer is yes if they passed a law.
Okay. I know you're defending the proposal. I'd like straight answers. The answer is they can pass a law and eliminate the emergency benefits altogether. Yes.
Yes, and again, within the bounds of the proposal, the money would then have to be spent within the UI system.
Okay. Mr. Weidinger, the percentage of long-term unemployed during this recession is historically higher than any previous record. Is that not true?
That's correct.
Is it accurate to say that about half of the unemployed have been unemployed for more than 6 months?
I believe so. I'd have to check the numbers. I know half of the people currently receiving unemployment benefits are on federal extended benefits. It's about a 4 million split. There's 4 million receiving state benefits and another 4 million receiving federal extended benefits.
And you indicated that there have been emergency benefits paid in previous recessions, right?
That's correct.
This recession has had the largest number of long-term unemployed, right?
It's been more long-term unemployed than previous recessions, yes.
Considerably so?
Not
Is there any other recession you know of where half of the unemployed were unemployed for more than 6 months?
I would have to go back and look, but my general recall is no.
Ms. Gilbert, what's the position of the Department of Labor on this proposal?
I believe that the committee has received a copy of the letter from Secretary Solis, which strongly opposes this bill. The concern that the Secretary expresses in the letter is that, similar to the one you expressed in your opening remarks, that at this time we continue to have 8 million, actually, individuals receiving unemployment insurance across all programs, and that to stop benefits, the extended benefits at this time when there are not only, there are still 4.5 unemployed workers for every job, that would be inappropriate for us to stop benefits at this time to take away their ability to feed their families. The concern is also that as the economy is recovering, unemployment insurance is generally considered an economic stabilizer, and that that for every dollar we spend on unemployment insurance, that $2 go back into the economy, and to take away those unemployment benefits today takes away the purchasing power of those unemployment insurance claimants and would actually kill jobs.
I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Black is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Weniger, what does it mean for the current federal program to be untargeted? And then if you could also follow up with what the consequence of that would be.
Sure, thank you. As I described in my walkthrough, the current program includes a variety of tiers, but the first tiers of benefits payable when somebody exhausts their regular state benefits today are payable in all states. So they're payable in the states with unemployment rates below 4% to those with unemployment rates of 10% or higher. Those first two tiers provide 34 weeks of benefits. So if you get 26 weeks of state benefits, you're going to get another 34 weeks of federal unemployment benefits unless you find a job in the meantime. We have never paid that many weeks of federal benefits, even in the highest states. So what that suggests is this program, especially compared to the history of such programs, is untargeted. And to the second point of your question, what that means is in some places, especially lower unemployment rate states, there are individuals receiving benefits who states might be able to work with to return to work, and where that would assist in the economy, it would assist in reducing taxes, minimizing some of the solvency concerns that both the administration and Congress has had. And so the untargeted nature of this program gets at the fact that many of the weeks, in fact, most of the weeks of the emergency program are payable in all states regardless of the unemployment rate.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Rangel is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. May I ask staff, does this unemployment benefit fall within the category that we normally refer to as an entitlement?
Yes.
As a result of this legislation, would we be changing an entitlement?
The legislation provides to the states all the money that is payable under temporary federal law.
We have
the bill does not change that.
We have a serious restriction in time, and so you know what an entitlement is, and either this changes an entitlement or it doesn't change it. So we can get to the details, but I can't get a follow-up unless you tell me, or unless you answer the question, does this change the entitlement?
Sir, what the bill says is...
No, please, sir, you're a professional, and I'm not in this area. I've read the bill. I'm outraged about the bill. I'm in strong support of what people are entitled to. We as members of Congress forever tell the people the difference between an entitlement and just receiving an appropriation. And so I need an answer to tell my constituents as to why I am not supporting this. And so can you please answer me? I know it's a difficult question, but does this bill change an entitlement, which you said this is what extended unemployment compensation is?
Not unless states provide for a state law making that change.
If the state does nothing, does this law allow them to reduce or eliminate the federal money that we're giving them to what looks like to me to be a block grant? Does it?
No.
What can they do under this law that they cannot do to entitlement right now under existing law?
As I described in my walkthrough,
As it relates to the amount of the check that the beneficiary gets, strike all of that. Can the state, under existing law, reduce a federal grant for extended unemployment compensation? Can the state reduce that amount of money?
states can opt out of the current
I
federal
said,
program.
can they reduce the amount of money that the federal government sends to a beneficiary?
Yes.
How?
They can opt out of the current emergency program by notifying the
That's
secretary
not
within 30
reduction,
days.
that's just elimination. Can they take that check and just reduce it and give them a lesser amount? Now,
No, because of
okay,
provisions in
the
the
answer
stimulus law.
is no. Will they be able to do it under this proposal?
Only if they pass a state law after enactment.
Would they be able to change the amount that the beneficiary gets, from the federal government and lower it?
Only if the state passes a law after the date of enactment.
And right now, if the state passes any law, they cannot do it.
As I said before, they can eliminate the program entirely. They can
I know,
opt out of
but
the
they
agreement.
cannot adjust the amount that the beneficiary gets.
No, because of a provision of current law. That's
So
correct.
would you not agree that what we're doing now is dramatically changing the entitlement to a block grant?
The bill provides to states all the money that would otherwise be payable under current law. It then allows the states to make changes that they believe are appropriate only in state law.
Sir, some of us don't have good relationships with our governors, but we want to have a very good relationship with our constituents. And so when we tell them the check is in the mail, they laugh. I think you're saying that the check goes to the governor and the state legislature, and they have the flexibility of making adjustments. Is that not so?
Mr. Rangel, those checks go to the governor and the state legislature today. They only go on a reimbursable basis at the end of the month to pay
But under
current
existing law,
benefits.
the governor and the state legislature, while they can opt out, as you repeatedly remind me, they cannot reduce the amount of the check that the recipients, not the governor, gets. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
So I think, I don't know how much time I got, but I think we conclude by saying that the entitlement as we know it under this bill will allow the governor to reduce the amount of money if he goes to the state legislature. And so we are forfeiting, as the Congress, the ability to make certain that they get what we think they should get by giving the state legislature and the governor the power to change it. Is that correct?
You
don't know
as
what
I,
that
no,
is.
sir. As I said before, the entitlement to individuals would continue.
this gotta end
It's
up with
provided
you
to states,
saying
and
yes.
they pass
It's
law.
gotta
All right, time has expired. Mr. Paulson's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Wenninger, if I can just sort of follow up then on this line of questioning. So can you just please explain what the default is that's established by the bill if no action is taken by the states when it comes to how states are going to use this $31 billion and how that would be forward funded?
Yes, sir. Section 201 provides for that default. It probably would be useful for me just to simply read that. It says, except as provided below, and the below is where states can pass laws to change it, amounts transferred to the state account pursuant to this bill shall be used only in the payment of extended compensation and emergency unemployment compensation. That refers to the two federal programs that are operating today in accordance with applicable provisions of federal and state law, including agreements and implementing regulations as in effect on May 1st. What that says is the default is states must use the money that's transferred to them for current purposes, for the current regime of federal extended benefits. And then the bill goes on and says if a state wants to pass a law to provide a different sort of unemployment benefit or other types of help to help the unemployed return to work or other ways of minimizing taxes so employers are able to hire, the bill allows the states to do that.
So Mr. Wenninger, so in other words, each state can continue paying exactly the same benefits as it's doing today, as many as 99 weeks, for instance, and still have all the money they need to do so under the bill or the proposal.
That's correct. In fact, the bill actually allows, if individual states wanted to add additional weeks and use the money for additional weeks for some individuals, they could do so. Again, they'd have to pass a law to choose to do so, but the bill contemplates that would be possible.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Stark is recognized. Okay. Mr. McDermott? Mr. McDermott's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking for the hidden agenda here because the President and the Senate got snookered by the House. We passed a 12-page bill on tax extenders in December, and 4 lines on the bottom of page 7, or page 8, said we're going to extend unemployment benefits for 1 year. Now, here the Republicans are back in here reneging on this. So I say to myself, why are they doing that? Well, I know enough about the program to know that states borrow money from the federal government. And if they borrow for 2 years, if they're 2 years in arrears, they suddenly trigger a higher unemployment tax on the employers in their state. Is that correct, Ms. Gilbert?
Yes, sir.
So we know in 3 states at least, Michigan, the chairman's state, and Arizona, also a Republican governor, and I don't know what the 3rd state is. Can you tell me the 3rd one that's triggered?
I believe it's South Carolina.
South Carolina. So we have another Republican governor. Now, those 3 states get a benefit here. The federal government says you can take this money that we designated to give to unemployed workers, and Governor, you can do anything you want. You can dig yourself out of whatever hole you're in. So this is really another way for the Republican. It looks to me like a way to take money away from the people on the bottom and give it to the people on the top. Is that a correct analysis of what could be done under this bill? Ms. Gilbert?
Yes, sir.
So this is taking the money out of the unemployed workers' pockets to bail out governors who are in financial trouble and won't face the facts and do what's fiscally necessary in their state. We are basically punishing unemployed workers in order to bail out the governor of Michigan. And in my view, that is not right. You have people in this, you saw the chart. Could you put that chart up again about how many jobs there are and how many people there are who are unemployed? That's somewhere in the bowels of the machinery. I mean, it's 14 million people without jobs in this country, and we've got 4 million jobs available. We've got 4 people looking for every job. Is that about the number today? In
4.5.
4.5. So it's not as though these people are sitting at home, rocking on the front porch stairs, or the front porch in the rocking chair, waiting for their check to come from the state capitol. There aren't jobs if they went out there and looked for them. Is that a fair statement?
Who's running this show?
Ms. Gilbert?
Yes, sir.
So the whole idea, you know, this thing is reminiscent of when this whole bill was put together in 1935. The last argument that was argued in the United States Senate when the Social Security Act of 1935 passed with unemployment insurance in it was whether or not we created a moral hazard in the unemployed in this country by giving them an unemployment check. That has been the Republican mantra since 1935, and here we are, and they're doing it again to bail out Republican governors. I yield back the balance of my time.
Great job.
Thank you. Ms. Gilbert, it's true that 21 states will actually be paying higher federal taxes on unemployment in calendar year 2011, is it not?
I believe it might be even 23. That's
Okay,
right.
yeah, so it's not just 3.
Yeah.
And I would, without objection, submit into the record the data about states with federal unemployment loans, and it includes their unemployment rate and the federal tax hike that they'll be facing. So this is not just about 3 states. Mr. Brady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is one agenda in this bill. Everyone needs to know. It is to get people back to work. We know what's happening now from the government isn't working. Here we are after expending $800 billion in the stimulus, and there's nearly 2 million fewer Americans working today than when all that spending occurred. And we are at the lowest worker participation rate in a quarter of a century. People forget about that, but that makes the point. We have fewer people who can work working today than since the 1980s. So we know this isn't working. And Mr. Whitinger, what I understand is this bill is fairly prescriptive to the states, telling them that they can get their people back to work, doing a combination of 4 things as I understand it: to support their state unemployment benefits without the need for higher taxes, to provide extended benefits after workers exhaust the state benefits, to prevent tax increases on the small businesses who and mid-sized businesses hiring these workers, or provide reemployment services, helping workers get either the skills or the job opportunities to go back to work. Is that accurate? Is that what limitations in this bill creates flexibility, but it's very prescriptive about what these dollars can be used for, correct?
That's correct.
And what happens if the Jobs Act doesn't pass? What are almost certain to occur within the states as they try to get people back to work?
Right. Well, as your list suggests, what would happen is states wouldn't have flexibility over this funding. They wouldn't be allowed to use it for the purposes that you suggested, and the money could only be paid for the current highly prescriptive regime of federal extended benefits. So if states wanted to provide a different duration of benefits, use the money for regular benefits or other types of unemployment benefits, use it for reemployment services, or simply use it to reduce the balances of their loan, preventing tax hikes, or pay back the interest on those loans, preventing tax hikes on small businesses, they wouldn't be allowed to do that.
Can you explain that? As a number of states are in deep trouble, have borrowed a lot of money by law. Without this bill passing, we'll have to pay that back, which means significant tax hikes actually on job creators for hiring people. Is that correct?
Unemployment taxes are payroll taxes on jobs. So there are taxes, and the federal tax especially is applied against the first $7,000 in wages. So it's especially heavily targeted on low-wage jobs. So what would happen, again, is you would be facing higher taxes on especially those types of jobs. And as the discussion about the loans suggests, about $1 billion in state taxes are required just simply to pay the interest on the federal loans, which total about $40 billion across those 30-some states.
So in Washington's perverse thinking, if states are having trouble getting people back to work, let's make them raise the taxes on the companies that would likely hire them.
That's correct.
Thank you. Chairman, yield back.
Mr. Neal's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that the metaphor that we're looking here to apply is not just the safety net, but the trampoline effect, and that is that people who have great work histories and are seeking to remain in the job market find themselves, for whatever reason, outside of that market, and then as they endlessly try to seek new employment and are unsuccessful, that we're telling them that the trampoline's not going to work for them. Now, let me use an example. I'm concerned that in the 2009 bipartisan reforms, TAA lapsed. And this past February, as a result, fewer workers are eligible for TAA, and those that do qualify are eligible for less support and training assistance, which will inevitably impair their ability to get good-paying jobs. Last week, I understand that the Labor Department rejected 3 petitions for TAA because the workers seeking assistance were service workers. Such workers were eligible for TAA under the 2009 reforms, but now, because they've expired, no assistance is available to these workers. So the point is that, on one hand, we're pulling back from extending unemployment benefits from people who have been unemployed for a considerable period of time, again, with great work histories, and at the same time, eliminating the prospects of them taking courses in the interim for the purpose of upgrading their skills. Is that correct, Ms. Gilbert?
The TAA program is not one that I administer, but at this point that you are correct that the TAA coverage has been reduced as a result of recent legislation.
So what we're saying here is that we need to better engage unemployed workers, and then we allow the training programs to lapse. The number of reforms that were made to the trade adjustment program, such as providing coverage to service workers and making a greater investment in training, has now fallen by the wayside. Our friends on the other side are blaming the unemployed for being unemployed, despite the fact that, particularly in the automobile sector and other places across the country, these are individuals who have been employed for many, many years, subject to the vagaries of the market, obviously, but at the same time, when they fall outside the mainstream of economic life, the TAA programs were constructed for the purpose of giving them a bounce back into the mainstream. And that's why we find ourselves in this predicament, and now saying to them once again, geez, you might have served in Iraq, you might have served in Afghanistan, and if you find yourself unemployed, we're sorry about that, so we're not going to help you with retraining or upgrading skills, and we're going to cut your unemployment benefits. That's the message that we're sending with the proposal that's in front of us today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you. Thank you. And Ms. Gilbert, I realize this was an area that you did say you did not have expertise in, so we'll give you a pass on that. But there was no legislation. It expired. And so I would hope you'd be careful about your remarks.
My apologies, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
And my colleague did correct me.
Thank you for correcting
There was
that.
a lack of legislation, Mr. Chairman.
There was a lack of legislation, but that's not what the witness said.
Which passed through
Regular
this
order,
committee.
Mr. Levin.
Well,
Regular order. At this time, I'll recognize Mr. Smith for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses here. On the job search topic, Mr. Whitinger, can you explain what the minimum job search requirements are?
Yes, sir. Minimum job search requirements are, they mimic the minimum job search requirements that apply to just the extended benefits program, basically the last of the federal programs that operate today. And what they say is they provide for specific conditions about things like searching for work and registering with the Employment Service and providing resume and accepting suitable work if it's found for you. But those provisions, as they exist in federal law today, only apply to that last program. In a world of up to 99 weeks of benefits, what federal law says today is, here are minimum job search requirements, but they apply in effect as late as weeks 80 to 99 of your unemployment benefit receipt. And it leaves to states to define what job search means in the states. And as we heard in the subcommittee hearing on this topic in February, there are some states where there may not be job search requirements. For example, some states don't apply a job search requirement if the state unemployment rate is above 8.5%. There may be other specific groups that are exempted from job search requirements. This says the minimum federal standards that apply in a federal program at the end of, that's currently at the end of somebody's receipt of benefits, should apply starting from the beginning of their receipt of benefits.
So that would only happen if this legislation were adopted.
That's correct, and I believe there are some expressions of bipartisan support for that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Becerra is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And if I could ask the staff to put on the screens the chart that's labeled Tough Job Market for the Unemployed, which Mr. Levin used previously. Again, thank to you for your responses to the various questions. I have a concern with regard to how this bill could be used. The way the bill...
If the gentleman would suspend, I don't believe we have copies of that. If you could have your staff pass out the copies while you're... Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we can see, as Mr. Levin had pointed out previously, it's fairly difficult for Americans today to secure employment very quickly. That's why under this Bush recession, we have seen Americans take the longest time in trying to get reemployed. But as we can see, even if they are lucky to get a job, they are the lucky few so far. And fortunately, under the President's proposals, in the last 14 months, we've seen 2 million jobs created in this country, and so many of those Americans are getting back to work. But when you see the effects of the Bush recession and how they gripped so many Americans, it makes it difficult to believe that we would now allow states to shirk their responsibility to try to help those folks when it's the federal taxpayers, American taxpayers, who've actually contributed money to the system so the states can then pay these jobless benefits for Americans who are waiting to go back to work. My colleague and friend, Mr. T-Berry, mentioned his father, who lost his job after 25 years. I've mentioned in the past my father, who was a road construction worker for about 30 years, and how during the rainy season in Sacramento, California, he would often find himself unemployed for 2, sometimes 3 months, depending on how long the rainy season lasted. He had to go out and look for work wherever he could. And fortunately for us, he typically found side jobs. But he also relied on the unemployment benefits that he had paid for while he worked to help him survive. Now, my understanding from this legislation is that this bill would require someone like Mr. T-Berry's dad or my father, who was a road construction worker with a 6th grade education, or could tell the 60-year-old carpenter who's a 30-year journeyman who, because the housing market is in the dumps, can't find a job, that before that carpenter or Mr. T-Berry's father or my father could collect unemployment benefits for which they paid all those years that they worked, they'd have to go back and get a GED. So that 60-year-old man who's a journeyman of carpentry for 30 years, my father who is as skilled as any when it comes to road construction, whether it's laying concrete or positioning those pipes that you and I rely on for our water, he'd have to go back and get a GED after more than 50 years of being out of school and only getting to the 6th grade before he could collect benefits, unemployment benefits for which he paid. Now, I'm not sure if that was an intentional provision in this bill, but Ms. Gilbert, wouldn't that be a punishment for America's workers who, because of the Bush recession, not their own fault, lost their job?
Well, I think your point that providing a GED preparation for all unemployed workers may not be the appropriate reemployment strategy.
Right, and I appreciate that we want to get folks skilled. I have a daughter who just got accepted to a great university, and so she will get a great education. But my father, it wasn't his fault that as the first in his family as a child, he had to go out and start working at the very tender age of 6 years old and only got to about the 6th grade. To ask him if he had, we're now not retired, but if he were still working, all of a sudden have to get a GED before he could collect the unemployment benefits, that would be a travesty for millions of Americans who are extremely skilled, that 60-year-old carpenter. And I'm not sure if we want to do that. Now, Mr. Weidinger, I hope you can explain to me why it is that we would want to give a state the discretion to use the monies that are meant to help jobless Americans hard hit by this Bush recession to pay back a state loan, or a loan provided by the federal government, by the federal taxpayers to the state, so it could provide jobless benefits to its residents, or why we would want to let a state that doesn't want to have its corporations contribute their legally responsible fair share to those jobless benefits, to provide those corporations with a tax cut with federal taxpayer money that is meant to go for jobless benefits for hard-hit Americans who are unemployed.
First, in response to your previous discussion with Ms. Gilbert, the bill includes a broad exception that says if the states determine that the GED requirement is unduly burdensome to the individual,
but that's if
they can waive the requirement.
That's if a state finds that to be a case. And that means each and every individual, my father, Mr. T-Berry's father, that 60-year-old carpenter, has to hope that the governor will find that there's a hardship in their case and that they don't have to go through that requirement with money that they, in fact, contribute to the system.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes Mr. Doggett for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Weidinger, we've enjoyed a good bipartisan relationship on the subcommittee. I plan to maintain that, and will save most of my remarks for the speech I'll give on the amendment that I have to this bill. I just want to ask you a few specific questions, one of which I posed to you previously. As you know, many of us believe that in Texas, my home state, that our employers are having to pay more because our governor insisted that the unemployed receive less in rejecting monies that were available for Texas. And in fact, Texas, unlike most states, actually went out to Wall Street and issued private bonds or public bonds to pay for its debt. As best I can determine from talking with experts here and in Texas, under this legislation, there would be nothing to prevent Governor Perry from calling the legislature into session and taking the monies available for the long-term unemployed and using that money, if the legislation were approved, to pay down the debt to Wall Street.
Mr. Doggett, as I think you know, we've consulted with the CRS, and they have actually conferred with DOL, and prior regulations suggest that in instances like this, where there's private bonds, the principal, but not the interest, could be payable with this sort of money.
Could take from the unemployed and pay down the principal on the bonds.
For these types of bonds, just like the underlying loans that all other states have.
And also, whether it's Texas or some other state, there would be nothing to prevent the state from using these monies taken from the long-term unemployed to reduce their unemployment tax rate even lower.
Again, as I discussed with Mr. Rangel, if they chose to pass a law to spend the money within the bounds of the UI system after enactment, they could do so.
And that gets to another key point about this legislation, because as I read the paper that you put out responding to the statement Mr. Levin and I had, I can't tell how much confidence you have in this legislation. You say that there are only, I believe, 10 states that will be in session after July 1st. Is the feeling that this bill is really illusory in its benefits to most states?
I think discussion of that simply gets at the facts that this legislation allows states to pass legislation after they receive the funds. But that's just a simple fact statement about which states are in regular session.
You don't expect most of them to do it. Isn't that the thrust of the paper?
It's not for me to make statements about expectations.
Well, as far as statements you maybe can make as a professional about expectations, the maximum benefit in taking from the unemployed to the state and giving to the states for the purposes that they deem appropriate under our unemployment system is, I believe, $3.1 billion if this were enacted right now. Isn't that the most? If all the states approved implementing legislation, the maximum amount of money available that we're talking about is a little over $3 billion.
Section 201 makes available $31 billion to the states. That reflects all the remaining federal temporary funds.
I got my decimal point at a critical point, but $31 billion.
That's correct.
And is it true that if this bill is not approved by the Senate and signed into law by the President until, say, September or October, it will be less than that?
The bill would have to be redrafted because the premise is the remaining funds at that point in time. And in September or October, there would be fewer remaining funds. So that's correct.
Well, this, at best, is temporary assistance to the states from the long-term unemployed if the states choose to use it. And when this year is up, the states will basically be in about the same situation they're in now, won't they? It's not any kind of long-term solution. It's just a patch.
It provides some flexibility over what are temporary funds. But again, it would leave to the states to determine what to do with those funds. And so they could make decisions that might have application beyond just the rest of this calendar year.
And then lastly, where did this idea of having the states opt out of the extended unemployment benefits come from? I see there's some endorsement from some groups here, but this seems to be as I said, kind of a jack-in-the-box idea. What is the source of it? Is this we had Heritage there, I know, saying that unemployment and Pell Grants and the like are welfare. Is this a Heritage idea? No.
I'm not going to comment on that. As you well know, we had a hearing in February. That hearing was about efforts to reemploy individuals. It covered things like work search, education requirements, many of the provisions of this bill. There were also general concerns expressed by a number of the witnesses there about the taxes that are currently in place and rising in states, especially because of the loans. This bill is an effort to address that, consistent with the hearing that we had.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you. Mr. Berg is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I really like the chart that was shown here. I mean, that shows our problem. Our problem is we only have 3 million job openings, and we have close to 14 million people unemployed. And I guess we need to come together, I think. If we don't change anything, it's not going to fix itself. In fact, my biggest fear is if we do nothing, what happens is 21 states are going to get hit with a 40% increase on the employer tax. And if you think about the 3 million jobs, we have to ask ourselves, will that tax encourage employers to add employees or not? You know, fundamentally, it shows that it doesn't. I mean, the challenge we have with unemployment is the fundamental thing is build up your trust fund in good times And so in lean times, you can support those employees that are out of work. And we're kind of getting all messed up here, I think, because we're not really keeping that on focus. Here's one of the important questions that's getting bounced around, a lot of rhetoric. So I just want to be clear. If we pass this bill and the people from our state who've been elected by the citizens of those states, if the state legislature and the state government does nothing, what benefits will change?
None. The bill in Section 201.
I just want to almost ask you that again. So if we pass this and a state whose elected legislative members and governor says we don't want to change anything, will there be any effect on people that are currently receiving unemployment benefits?
No. The bill directs the states to take the money and continue to pay current federal unemployment benefits with them under the two programs.
So fundamentally what we're saying here, I see, is we're saying to the states, you know what, we recognize we have a problem. And we want to be a partner with the states, those people that are closest to the problem, and we want to come up with creative solutions that help people get back to work, that help, if it's educational training they need, if it's job training. That's what we're saying in this bill. We're actually taking the handcuffs off, and I think it'd be very refreshing to the states. So the fundamental thing that I see that signals that is also the waiver. And how do you see the waiver helping states?
Thank you, Mr. Berg. The waiver authority is new authority within the UI system. It's not new authority compared to other programs the committee is operating. For example, Chairman Davis and former subcommittee Chairman McDermott actually have a bill to extend child welfare waiver that does follows many of the same themes of this legislation. In the past, the committee has acted and provided states with waiver authority over welfare law. Those waiver demonstrations that states operated in the late 1980s and early 1990s informed federal policy. They informed federal policy, including on some of the provisions that are reflected in this bill, things like education, work requirements, job search, and so forth. And then those demonstrations, what was learned by the states in those waiver programs, was then incorporated in what became the 1996 welfare reform law. So this is an effort to spur the same sort of innovation with regard to reemployment, specifically of unemployed individuals, as the committee has authorized in other programs and has been used successfully to provide for previous federal law.
Well, are there some specific examples in other law where these waivers have created jobs because they had the flexibility in the state level?
Sure. I actually have a personal story where I went to Fond du Lac County in Wisconsin, and there I met with the welfare director in, I believe it was early 1995. And he talked about the waiver program that was being operated in that county. And he showed the welfare caseload and its trend over time, and basically it fell off a cliff. But the implementation of their waiver policy, which said they had to have an immediate work requirement and a 2-year lifetime limit on welfare benefits in that county, was actually beyond the point where the caseload declined. And so my question to him was, what happened? And he said, word got out on the street that you were going to have to work for welfare benefits, and there was going to be a time limit, so people said, I'm going to go take that job. So that's an example of how in the past this sort of authority has been provided in states and counties, down to the individual level, have operated improved programs.
Oh, thank you. I'll yield back.
Mr. Thompson's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of things I want to raise, but I want to start by just mentioning I think it's just a very cruel hoax on the people who are unemployed and have worked so hard and paid into this program to title this bill the Jobs Bill. There's not a single job created by this bill, and quite honestly, that's what we should be doing in this Congress, is figuring out how to get people back to work, not figuring out how to punish people who, for no fault of their own, have lost their job. On the issue of, I think Mr. Becerra raised it, of rewarding states for their fiscal misbehavior, I just want to point out the GAO finding on state unemployment insurance solvency, and I'll just quote from them on their study released May 2010, and I quote, "Long-standing UI tax policies and practices in many states over 3 decades have eroded trust and fund reserves, leaving states in a weak position prior to the recent recession." So it just seems somewhat ironic that we want to set up a means by which to benefit them for this fiscal irresponsibility. And then lastly, I have information here that says that the multiplier for unemployment insurance is greater than any other possible uses under the proposed act. This says spending on unemployment insurance program gives the economy its biggest bang for the buck in terms of job creation because the GDP multiplier effect of unemployment compensation, which CBO estimates in a range from 0.7 to 1.9, is greater than any other possible use under this act. So this could, in fact, hurt any economic recovery that we may be facing. Do I read that correctly? I'd like to hear from both of you on that.
Well, first, I would say it depends on how the states choose to spend it and what the multiplier, if you depend on such numbers, for how the states might otherwise spend this money.
So do they have a way that can generate a greater multiplier? CBO says no.
Sir, if the goal is to return somebody to work, and for example, this money is used by states to provide wage subsidies so that an individual can actually take a position that an employer otherwise might not be able to fill.
So you disagree with the
CBO
CBO numbers?
I'm sorry?
You disagree with the CBO analysis?
I don't disagree with the analysis. What I'm saying is, under the legislation, states would have the capacity for spending the money differently. So you would have to know what the multiplier is for the ways that the states would spend the money differently to know the answer of whether this is a net increase or a net decrease when it comes to jobs.
But the point of the CBO remarks is that the multiplier is greater in regard to unemployment insurance than it would be if it were used for something else. Ma'am, do you have a comment on that?
I don't know that I have any analysis on the wage subsidy issue, but I can definitely say that it's of concern if the money were used to simply pay down the debt. And there would be no multiplier effect, and that's going to start to begin to hurt the economy.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, in regard to the paying down the debt issue, could we get this GAO finding made part of the record?
Without objection.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Davis is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find the discussion rather interesting. I like fact-based dialogues as an engineer, and I find it interesting that the statements that have begun by the minority have used the term reneging, cruel hoax, hatchet job, rewarding states' fiscal mismanagement. As a businessman and as a member of Congress, I, and hopefully all of you, are committed to creating jobs. And I think it comes down to this rhetoric, reminds me of some of the debates that we had in the last Congress where there was a lot of greenhouse gas created, but it wasn't based on the truth. I mean, clearly some false statements have been made. The gentleman from Washington condemning this bill when we, in fact, are co-sponsoring a bill together on a child welfare waiver extension that embodies the same exact principles that are put into this bill here. And the gentleman from Michigan made statements that our colleagues were reneging. I happened to manage one of those extensions with the gentleman from Washington last year, and said that we're reneging on a promise. Well, that simply is an untrue statement. The purpose of unemployment is to assist people as they are finding a job. Was it gentleman? No, I will not. As my colleagues back in my state have said, they want to help people find jobs. We've seen in our hearings, the first one held over 90 days ago, there was a request, and there's a continuing drumbeat of requests from the states for flexibility. And I guess the first question that I have for Mr. Weidinger is this: does this bill renege on any existing commitment in law?
No, sir. As previous discussion suggested, if states do nothing else, they must continue to pay current
Thank
federal
you.
benefits with it.
So therefore, we have it again.
Gentlemen,
No.
you mentioned my name. Will you?
No. You mentioned Mr. Teaberry's name and then yield to him. I'd like to finish this
No,
line of
Mr.
reasoning.
Tebow never asked me if...
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask for regular order.
Mr. Davis has the time.
What I would say, though, is we make these statements, let's come back to the actual text of the bill. Something that we're actually trying in this context to do rather than seeing legislation go straight to the floor. It's clear that there's no reneging. The question then moves to Ms. Gilbert. Do you believe that the purpose of the state unemployment agencies, the workforce cabinets and departments across our states, that they're committed to try to get people reemployed? Yes or no?
Yes.
Absolutely. I agree. Our own workforce cabinet leader is totally committed to this. He also is interested in flexibility and things that can be done to meet the unique needs of states. So I don't think there's a reneging of promise if we're looking at giving the states, 50 states with 50 unique need sets, the flexibility to help these people get back to work, which we desperately want to do. As I've said many times in my years in Congress, the goal is not to raise taxes, it's to create taxpayers and have a policy that will create taxpayers. Do you agree that we want to create taxpayers? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. The reason that I'm asking this question is you affirmed a statement that was made by one of the members on the other side when he said, isn't this bill just taking from the bottom to give to the top? And you said, well, yes. And do you really believe that based on what you just said?
I do believe that, well, let me just say factually, I think that
Factually based on the text in this legislation.
That in order that we came into this recession with states who had challenges with their trust funds. And those states are now facing serious challenges in paying back their debt. There's no question about that. And I might also add the President's proposal does help to get to relief on those around that debt, at least temporarily, while we're moving through recovery. So to get to and offer relief to taxpayers now at the cost of unemployment benefits, I think is the issue.
And I agree with we're dealing with the cost of unemployment benefits, the idea being to create jobs in the long run. And I would just appreciate as we look at this, we want to see people come back to work, but in this committee and on my subcommittee, the only piece of legislation I've seen related to unemployment reform beyond this bill was a Democrat extension of the existing program for 14 more weeks, which is not paid for effectively. And the question in the long run, I believe, is if we want to get people back to work, we need to empower people to go back to work and allow the people's representatives in the various states working with their governors to make decisions on the context of the application of the current benefits. I yield back.
All right, Mr. Larson's recognized.
I thank the Chairman, and I thank him for holding this markup today. And it becomes increasingly clear, and I have nothing but great respect for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, but the differences become more abundant, clearer, and more focused as we proceed through these budget discussions and through the various markups that we have. Look, we live in the greatest country in the world. We're entrepreneurial, capitalistic. We want to make sure that we continue along those lines with great risk and great reward. But part of that great risk and reward is that in return we say to the citizens we're sworn to serve that there is a basic compact, a social contract that exists, a safety net that will be provided for those who work hard and play by the rules, but through no fault of their own find themselves thrown on the vagaries of a system based on risk and reward. And to those ends, we've created systems of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and, of course, unemployment insurance as well. And yet they are under siege and assault. And our colleagues seem to be taken aback by the fact that Democrats would stand up and be appalled by this assault. This isn't just one case. This is an ongoing assault on the basic social contract that we have with the American people. Why do we have it? Because of a Great Depression, because of elderly who went without having any kind of health care, and because of a system that when we have unemployment, we need to help to keep this economy going. This is a compact with the people. And what we see here, and you can understand our frustration, is more of the same. In the most recent budget, $4 trillion cut out of Medicare while providing $4.3 trillion in tax breaks for the nation's wealthiest 1%. That's what has alarmed us. I yield the balance of my time to Sandy Levin, who I know has been wanting to respond.
Look, there was no consultation with this legislation. We didn't introduce the President's proposal in part because it was rejected by our chairman. And I just want to say, in terms of reneging, Mr. Davis, that's precisely what you're doing. You voted to extend this program through the end of the year. You voted.
The gentleman yield.
Let me finish. And you're now essentially saying to the states that they can cut it out and use it for other purposes. That's what you're doing. That's reneging. That's changing your vote. Every single one of you who were here voted to extend this program through the end of the year. That was part of our understanding. And now, because I guess you want relief for the states, but the evidence is clear from the GAO what has happened here. The states underfunded unemployment compensation. That's what they did. And the reference to welfare, look, there were differences of opinion about trying to withdraw welfare benefits if people did not go to work. That was a big argument. But what this is saying, the bottom line is, to unemployed, we're going to allow states to withdraw your benefits because we think there needs to be some penalty if you don't go to work. That is an insult to the unemployed of this country, to this historic number of long-term unemployed in this country. And you are going to find the unemployed speaking. It's reneging and it's an insult. It doesn't create jobs.
$35,000 a year if we work 20.
And instead of sitting down and talking about how we handle the problems, look, I come from a state that owes the federal government a lot of money. The last thing I'm going to do is to vote for a bill that says to the hundreds of thousands of unemployed people in Michigan that the legislature and the governor can take away your benefits in order to pay back what they owe to the federal government. That is an insult, it is irresponsible, and it is insensitive.
I guess
and
you're
it's
not going to yield.
reneging.
The gentleman's time has expired. Dr. Bustani is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Gilbert, your position is Administrator for the Office of Unemployment, is that correct?
That's correct.
And earlier, when this chart was referred to, you affirmed the validity of the chart. Am I correct?
It is, our numbers say that there are 4.5 unemployed workers for every job.
Right, okay. Well, this says 13.7 million unemployed workers. Can you give me a breakdown on how many or what percentage of those are skilled versus unskilled?
I do not have the statistics with me, but we can certainly try to determine if we can give those to you.
Okay, if you would, please.
I can share, because of the educational requirement, that I do know that at least 14.6% of those folks have less than a high school degree.
Okay. And with regard to job openings, the 3.1 million job openings, do you have a breakdown on skilled versus unskilled?
I do not. But again, we can go back and talk with my workforce colleagues.
Is it your opinion that enough has been done for job creation in this country?
I think my opinion isn't the one that counts here, but I do know that the President has certainly committed to job creation and is one of his #1 priorities.
So how do you explain a moratorium on energy production in this country?
I have
Existing energy production in the Gulf of Mexico and future energy production off the East Coast and West Coast, which the majority of Americans support. This would create high-paying jobs, both skilled and unskilled, and in my experience, these jobs have been shown to oftentimes lead to the first in a family to go on to college and get higher education. Is that job promotion?
This is not an area that I can comment on. I apologize.
Well, it's about job promotion. It's about job promotion. So let me ask you this. Would you say that you're proud of the administration's record on job promotion?
Again, this isn't an area that
I'm just asking
my opinion
I'm asking
is
your
irrelevant,
opinion.
and I apologize, I can't comment on that.
Okay, all right.
let me change tax just a moment. What happens if this legislation or some other approach is not taken with the unemployment benefits program? What's going to happen? What's going to happen with the states? They've borrowed money. They don't have much flexibility in what's, in how they're going to deal with this. So what happens? They're on the hook. They've borrowed money. They have interest payments. What's going to happen?
Well, many of them are currently working through their state legislatures and with their stakeholders in their states to determine new financing models for their unemployment insurance systems. There are also structural pieces in how UI works that allow that actually force states to begin to automatically pay back the loan, which is the FUTA tax credit reductions if you've borrowed for more than 2 years, et cetera. We recognize, however, and the President recognizes that that's currently in the current circumstances may be burdensome on employers and could defer job creation. So
it will hurt job creation.
He has proposed.
So it will hurt job creation. That's what
there is clearly a balance in raising taxes on employers during a time when you're trying to recover from an economy, and the President recognizes that and has proposed a slightly different tack in terms of providing relief to states for 2 years for the tax credit reductions and for the interest payments, and then looking toward trust fund solvency in a different way by raising the wage base, the taxable wage base in 2014 at a time when we should be moving more toward economic recovery.
Mr. Whitinger, if we do nothing, I think you talked a little bit about this, but could you expound in the remaining time I have on if we take no steps at this stage?
Sure. If we take no steps, what the President is trying to alleviate with respect to just the states with the loans, the interest payments that require state tax hikes that Ms. Gilbert described, the higher federal taxes because the states haven't paid the loans back will happen. What the jobs bill provides is funding that states may use if they pass laws to choose to alleviate some of those problems. So some of the tax hikes on the state side especially, but even conceptually on the federal side, could be alleviated if states pass a law to do so.
So the statement that was made earlier, I think by the other side, that states can do anything with this is really not accurate. The states have flexibility to work within their own system, within the confines of the law, to deal with unemployment issues, employment, and so forth. I mean, it's still
That's correct.
confined to that area.
That's correct.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Kind is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, may I request that the chart, tough job market for the unemployed, be put on the screen to help me make my point?
Yes.
I appreciate that. Ms. Gilbert, let me start with you. Now, clearly there has been job progress in this country over the last 14 months. In fact, last Friday we had a latest job report that showed that we've now had 14 consecutive months of private sector job growth. Is that correct?
I've read that in the news, so I believe so.
Over 2 million private sector jobs have been created in the last 14 months. Now, just in comparison, in the final 14 months of the Bush administration, 3.7 million jobs were lost. So there has been progress being made, but clearly we're not out of the woods, would you say?
When we still have only 4.5 unemployed workers for every job.
That's exactly what this chart demonstrates. But were you also familiar with the recent article that the Wall Street Journal came out citing Department of Labor statistics that shows that approximately 1 million people in the United States were unable to find work after exhausting their unemployment benefits over the past year? Does that sound about right?
Yeah, yes.
And so, you know, there may be an underlying premise behind this legislation that we have a bunch of deadbeat, sloth-like people collecting unemployment benefits, and all they need is a nudge out the door, and the jobs are there for them to have. So one of the options states should have is to cut them off. And that's what I think is really at the heart of this legislation. And yet, Ms. Gilbert, this legislation could be viewed more as a job killer rather than a job creator because of the GDP multiplier effect on unemployment compensation versus any other reason that states can use to spend the money under this legislation. Is that right?
That is the Secretary's concern, as she expressed in her letter.
It's not just the Secretary's concern, but it's the Congressional Budget Office, and virtually every economist in this nation says that the biggest bang for the buck, multiplier effect that we could have, is the extension of unemployment benefits. Because these people need the money, they're going to spend it, they're typically going to spend it locally, and that's going to generate economic activity.
any other option that's proposed under this legislation would give us a worse or virtually non-existent multiplier effect for GDP purposes. Is that right?
That is a concern, yes.
In fact, one of the options, if states choose to move forward on it, is to take all the money that would normally go to unemployment benefits and use it to pay down debt. Is that right?
That's one of the options provided in the bill.
And that gives you a zero multiplier effect in the economy versus virtually a $2 for every dollar invested in unemployment compensation. Is that right?
I have not done specific analysis, but yes, I do believe that is correct.
And Mr. Weidinger, let me ask you. Now, if under this legislation as it's drafted, if states so choose, the legislature and governors agree, they could take every dollar that would normally go to unemployment compensation for the workers in their state and use it to pay down the debt that they now owe. Is that right?
They could use it to pay back the federal debt that they borrowed from the federal government. That's correct.
How can this bill not be viewed as another TARP-like bailout from the federal government going to the states, that the states can now use to pay back a debt that they owe, and in many instances they caused this problem themselves by underfunding the trust fund that would go to unemployment compensation. In fact, it's even worse than that, because a lot of the TARP funds that went to financial institutions that was used to pay down immediate debt that they were facing ultimately was paid back in its entirety plus interest to the American taxpayer. States under this legislation has no requirement to pay back a dollar that they use for debt reduction. Is that correct?
There's no requirement that, you're correct, there's no requirement that
If they
use
so
this money
choose
to
to
pay for
use
debt.
the money to pay down debt, and they take that option, there's no requirement that at some point in the future when they get healthier economically, that they have to pay that money back to the federal government, the amount of money that they use for debt reduction. Is that right?
Sir, the money paid back to the federal government for debt reduction is paid back to the federal government.
Right.
But they're paying back the federal debt.
But that's new money that they're using that would normally go to pay unemployed workers in their state. Is that correct?
That would be correct and would have the effect of reducing taxes as the president's own proposal seeks to do.
So I don't see how you cannot view this as just another big federal bailout of the states, something that my colleagues on the other side vowed in the last election that they would not do, and now they're letting the states off the hook by giving them the option, if they choose, to use the money to pay down debt instead of honoring the pledge that they made of extending unemployment compensation to the workers, to the unemployed workers in our country. Now, Ms. Gilbert, let me ask you, too, because of the 23 states that may be looking at a higher unemployment tax rate occurring in this year, virtually all of them pay a 0.3% increase. Is that right?
Yes.
Except for three states, Indiana, Michigan, and South Carolina would be paying a higher tax this year. Is that
Time
right?
has expired. Mr. Roscoe's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can we put that slide back up real quick for the staff? Thank you. Look at those numbers that our friends on the other side of the aisle are highlighting. Now think about that in the context of a couple of years ago when we heard a steady drumbeat in this committee and in other places, and that said to us and to the nation that if only you spend $800 billion plus interest, $1 trillion, unemployment is going to peak at 8%. Turns out that was completely pumping sunshine because that didn't happen, and that's the acknowledgement of it. A complete failure. A failure so bad that the word stimulus has been basically erased from the administration's lexicon. You can't find them talking about it anymore. My friend from Connecticut says that there's an assault on the social contract. I agree with that, but I disagree as to who the assailant is. The assailant in this case is deciding to do nothing, to take $40 billion in liabilities, states that are underwater, keeping them completely hamstrung based on the definition and the numbers that are coming from the administration's Department of Labor, and whistling right past the scene, acting like it's all going to be fine if we just stick with the status quo. The status quo is a failure, and a recognition that we need to change things and give more flexibility to states is the only remedy. And with that, I yield to the gentleman from Ohio.
Thank the gentleman from Illinois. Mr. Levin, your logic would go like this. 11 Democrats on this committee voted against that deal in December, and thus far, they are opposed to giving unemployed workers additional benefits. That would be like me saying that. And I
No,
will not
because
yield
it was
because
for
you did not
will you
yield to me.
yield?
You did not yield to me, and I won't yield to you. But
You
that's
never
the same
asked
logic.
me to yield to you.
That's the same logic, Mr. Levin. And I wouldn't disgrace the members of the other side by telling them that you voted against the bill and therefore you voted against unemployment
Will you
insurance
yield?
for members. Mr. Weidinger, I wish Mr. Becerra was still here because my dad said to us growing up as a kid, as an immigrant coming from Italy, that the most important thing for you kids is to learn English. That's the great equalizer. It's the empowerment. In 1989, I had a teacher from an inner city school in Columbus come to me long before I was in elected office and said, can you help me start a program in one of the poorest neighborhoods of Columbus that helps people, adults, get a GED? And I said, well, why wouldn't the government do that? And she said the government doesn't do that. It writes them off. It says you can get job training, but you can't get a GED. And so we raised private dollars and started the Windsor Terrace Learning Center. And the first graduate was a lady who was close to 30, who got her GED and went into nursing school. And she hugged me and she said, thanks for believing in me. Now, fast forward to the late 90s under welfare reform, which gave states flexibility to create a program that allowed local communities to decide what was best for them. Our program was folded into a public program because now GED was a provider for people on welfare so they could go back and get their education or go into a work training program. Is the model that is being used for this, and we on this side of the aisle are just as concerned about the unemployed, like my father, like my sister, but isn't this about giving local officials, through approving legislation, the ability to meet the needs of their local folks who might be unemployed long-term and give them skills, whether it be job skills or that education, which I think over half of our unemployed do not have a GED?
That's the principle of the legislation, yes. And it is attempting to address what is one of the most serious problems in the labor market today. Let me quote from a Brookings Institution study from February of this year. 1 in 3 people in the United States with less than a high school diploma is either unemployed or underemployed today. Goes on to say, these differences in labor market participation, especially involving people with less than a high school diploma, undermine the country's social fabric. That's what's going on. We have individuals who do not have the skills for some of the jobs in the economy, and this bill is premised on expecting states to engage them in the type of activities that they would need to become a part of the economy.
Thank you so much. You're back.
Mr. Pascrell is recognized.
This is more bizarre, Mr. Chairman, than the debates we had on health care. I really believe that. Look, you can try to have it both ways, but you can't have it both ways. You're exactly right, my friend from Ohio. You're talking about investments in education. You want to talk about that today? On how we can get people unemployed and how we have to invest and what the responsibility is of the federal government? We'll talk about it. Look, my friend from Illinois, the last 14 months of the Bush administration, they lost 3.7 million jobs. 3.7 million. First 14 months of this administration, we gained 2 million jobs. On the day he raised his hand, the President of the United States, your president and my president, 750,000 jobs are lost that month. Let's put the record straight here. Look, we accomplished something today. Your side admitted that there's so many people looking for jobs, yet there are only 3 to 4 million job openings at this particular time. That's a monumental progress as far as I'm concerned. At least we believe, both of us, that most of the people who are unemployed are trying to find a job, and they're not simply sitting on their fannies. Let's go to Section 202. The best thing to do is read the bill, right? Section 202 says, there's a great provision here, federal payments to the Emergency Unemployment Compensation Program on July the 6th. It ends on July the 6th, according to this legislation. Section 202. This provision, therefore, terminates federal payments to the Emergency Unemployment Compensation Program. Can a state that opted out of this program be simply sending a letter to the Department of Labor and then they opt out? If a state passed a law to spend all the distribution under the bill to repay its federal loan or provide a tax cut to employers, all emergency unemployment compensation would stop in that state on the week of July the 6th. Is there any phase out of the benefits? No. It ends July the 6th. Now, I have to ask each and every one of you in your own hearts, why do you want to end what we agreed to last December, just a few months back? We said we're going to extend unemployment. You want to cut it off 6 months in. That's a renege. You're reneging on this, and you're reneged on the commitment you made to those people who are unemployed. My second point would be this. If the state, and there are 30 states, they need loans to pay for regular unemployment benefits, how many do you think will finance extended benefits with their own funds? How many do you think, Mr. Widener?
Mr. Pascrell, the states that currently provide these benefits would have all the money forward funded to them to continue to provide those benefits. And the legislation says unless they pass a law, they would have to provide.
And if they pass the law and they want to end this extended program in order to pay off their own loans, then what?
They could pass a law to do so.
And they could pass a law also to come up with the money themselves to pay for those extended benefits?
That's available to the states under
that's what,
law all the time.
Let's go to New Jersey. There's 204,740 individuals in New Jersey. 204,740 individuals could lose their unemployment benefits under this bill. New Jersey owes the federal government $1,222,000,000, et cetera, for unemployment benefits. That's what the bill is right now. This is what they owe. Under this bill, you think that Governor Christie would probably choose to pay down the state's debt? Or do you think he will continue to provide unemployment benefits and extend them? What would he do?
Sir, I don't know what Governor Christie would do. The legislation authorizes...
The problem is you don't know, and I don't know what any of these governors would do, which puts the unemployed in real jeopardy and risk. That's what we're talking about. We have an obligation and a responsibility to invest in education. Yes, we have that obligation and responsibility. That's why the President presented a budget, which I think makes sense and is reasonable, to try to help people who are unemployed, to either move into other areas or bring up their skills. I think that's a good idea. I think it means that the federal government might have to spend some money. Yeah, we may have to spend some money, but not to take the risk. At this particular proposal and Section 202 says it all. It is going to be a disaster.
Okay.
And we're going to bail out the states.
Time has expired. Mr. Schock is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I too am a bit surprised by the minority's wish to continue down a road of one-size-fits-all, and clearly based on their own statistics and graphs being shown before this committee, a system that hasn't done a very good job of putting people to work. I come from a state that has an unemployment rate higher than the national average, a state that has implemented a program. Let me back up. Most independent analysis has suggested that the stimulus bill has not done a very good job of putting people to work, as evidenced by the fact that the unemployment rate is substantially higher than that was suggested by the administration if it passed. However, there are some nuggets of information that seem to be hope that there may be programs out there that could help put people to work. One of them I'm aware of that was funded through the stimulus program is a Putting People to Work program. I know in my state of Illinois, the Illinois Putting People to Work program claimed that they put 26,000 Illinoisans to work. I've got a copy of a Chicago Sun-Times article where the governor is requesting from Congress more latitude, more ability to continue to fund this program. And I was wondering if Mr. Weidinger could explain to me and for the benefit of my state whether or not, if this bill passed, some of these monies could be redirected not to payment of their debt, but more importantly, payment towards putting people to work. In other words, paying people to show up, giving some benefit to employers for hiring, since we all recognize the problem here is we've got too many people unemployed, and those unemployed don't have job opportunities. So the question begs, how do we get them more opportunities? How do we get them more job openings? How do we get employers to offer more jobs? And it seems to me this would be an excellent way if, in fact, we could allow states to use some of this money to fund the program. Would that be allowed, Mr. Weidinger?
Yes, it would. The bill in Section 201 specifically allows states to use some or all, theoretically, of their share of the funds provided for reemployment services. And then it goes on to specifically list wage subsidies, which is the type of program that you're describing, the Put Illinois to Work program. That program was lauded by the governor, as you said. He said, when we have economic emergencies, we don't just watch people on the unemployment rolls. We roll up our sleeves, use our imagination, our creativity, and put people to work. So the governor suggested that that wage subsidy program supported through the stimulus law was putting people to work. No different in concept from this. This would allow the states to use this money that they would have the authority to pass a law to decide how to spend for exactly that same sort of program, in fact, to recreate that same program.
Ms. Gilbert, are you familiar with that program?
I was not.
Does that sound like a program that's a good idea?
The department is always interested in programs that help with reemployment. The concern, I think, is whether or not we pay for those programs at the cost of eliminating unemployment benefits.
Okay, but if there's no free money, and we assume that the same people who are unemployed would prefer to have a job, wouldn't it make more sense to pay them to work than to be unemployed?
Again, I think the department is very interested in looking at innovative programs to get folks reemployed, and we would be happy to work with the committee to explore those. I think there is still great concern that that would be done at the cost of unemployment benefits today.
If somebody's working, do they need unemployment benefits?
Generally not. I guess it depends on the job, but if they're fully employed, no, they would not be eligible for unemployment benefits.
So if we could find a program to fund that would put people to work, then the issue of unemployment for them would really not be an issue.
That's correct, but let me reiterate. I think we're interested in looking at innovative programs, but we believe that to take unemployment trust fund money, unemployment dollars that are intended today to help those individuals who may or may not be ready for that program or ready to go to work may not be the best approach.
Do you think the federal government or state governments are better equipped to come up with those programs?
Again, I'm not sure that it matters what I believe. I think generally our workforce system today is designed to be relatively flexible in allowing state and local folks to design their workforce programs under the Workforce Investment Act.
Time has expired.
Thank
Ms.
you.
Berkeley is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could comment on that, if you don't have any customers, it doesn't matter if you have wage subsidies. You could hire as many people as you want. You're not going to be able to sustain them if you don't have a customer base. Let me share with you what's happening in the state of Nevada. And I sound like a broken record, but perhaps it bears repeating. I've got the highest unemployment rate in the country. I've got the highest mortgage foreclosure rate in the country. People come over to me all the time when I'm home on the weekends, and they say, Congresswoman, I never missed a day of work. I never missed a mortgage payment. I lost my job. I'm losing my home. What are you going to do about it? So when I look at legislation, I try to figure out how this is going to help my constituents. Quite candidly, looking at this legislation, I don't think it creates a single job and isn't going to get a single one of my unemployed constituents back to work. Now, when we pass that tax compromise, I can tell you, having been in the Democratic caucus, that one of the things that was most enticing to my side of the aisle was this extension of unemployment benefits. And the idea now that we are changing the game And pulling the rug out from under this, I think, is being dishonest, because there was a deal made and a compromise made, and I don't say that in a negative sense. I think it was an important part of that tax bill that we passed. To go back on certain provisions of it, I think, is inappropriate at best. Let me tell you what my base is. I've got gaming and tourism, and I've got construction. For years and years, we had the lowest unemployment rate in the country because our economy was the hottest in the country. But now, Las Vegas in particular will be among the last cities to recover because we depend on people having disposable income elsewhere and coming into my community and spending money. Until that happens, my unemployment rate is going to continue to stay where it is, and we're having a very, very slow recovery. Now, this job training requirement, to me, I'm dealing with cocktail waitresses and waiters and card dealers. What am I retraining them for? How are we sending them to get a GED when even because of the problems we have in the state in our state economy, they're cutting all of the programs at the university and the community colleges? What are you retraining these people for? I mean, and, you know, we keep talking about my construction industry is in the doldrums. We're not building anything. So you can't train these cocktail waitresses to become construction workers because there's no business there either. You can't have somebody get laid off at Harrah's because there's no business and have them walk across the street to MGM and get a job. The entire industry is flat. So the idea that somehow it's the unemployed's fault that they find themselves unemployed, and just if they worked harder or got a GED or got job training, which you're cutting all of the programs anyway, somehow they're magically going to find a job is absolutely preposterous. I'm trying to keep people above water. Giving them an average of $300 in order to sustain their families is the very bare minimum that this country can do to the people that call themselves Americans and are proud to be it. So this entire concept is so insulting, and I'll give you an example of what is totally outrageous. Everybody on that side of the aisle just voted against providing loan guarantees for renewable energy projects. That is fundamentally important to the state of Nevada because we have an abundance of sun and wind and geothermal. So you're cutting any training programs and any job opportunities through the loan guarantees for my construction people to maybe find a different type of work. So this idea that all of a sudden this is going to be a panacea is absolutely insulting. And the thing with the service workers being cut out of that, most of the employees that work in the state, in Las Vegas, are service workers. They cater to a public that's not coming there. So we're not creating a single job by doing this. And I wanted to mention to Mr. Brady when he denigrated the stimulus bill, the stimulus package, the recovery bill created 34,000 jobs in the state of Nevada. I fail to see how this legislation will create a single job for the people that I represent to get back to work. So I think we need to talk honestly, and make sure that we provide jobs. This is not the bill to do that.
All right, thank you. Mr. Reichert's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to just cover a little bit of ground that's already been covered, but I'll try to be brief. Use some of the adjectives that some of my colleagues have used this morning, and to me, it sort of really tells you a lot about how weak their argument is when all we can refer to this bill as a hoax, a conspiracy theory, hidden agendas, assaults, and many other adjectives. Mr. Pasquarello said, let's look at the facts. And the facts are that really we all want to help people find jobs. We should be able to come together here somehow and agree on a way to get people back to work. And it seems to me that the most common sense way is to allow the states to make some decisions here, but there seems to be some resistance for some reason by some people on this body to suggest that because we don't know what the state officials, elected officials might do with a little bit of freedom that might be applied in this effort, that we shouldn't trust them, that we can't trust them to make the right decision about those unemployed in their own states and their own communities. Well, I think that's wrong. I think the people of each one of those states have trust and faith in each one of those elected officials. I think they trust them, and if they don't make the right decisions regarding each independent state, in regard to their unemployed, certainly the voters will speak. I think that gives them another opportunity, our citizens across this great country, to voice their opinion. But the facts are that why shouldn't states like North Dakota, for example, who has an unemployment rate of 3.6%, but still is restricted by the current law in how they apply the money they receive. The money that they receive is not going to change, but they have some ability here to make some decisions about their own citizens in the state of North Dakota. 3.6% unemployment rate. They should have the ability to have some leeway, some flexibility in applying those monies across their state as it applies to the people who live in that state. And there are other states across this country that have 6% unemployment. They should have the same freedom to make those decisions. And those of us on this body should respect the freedom that each and every one of those states and the people that live in those states and elect those officials, we should have respect for that process. This bill does create jobs. It just creates them in a different way. And I think the other side is opposed to this process and this bill, not really based on fact, as I said, because they use so many adjectives that describe it in conspiracy theory terms, but only because they're Democrats and we're not. That's my opinion. My question is, as we can all read how the Jobs Act would promote jobs. There are 5 reasons listed in the bill. But there's one in particular that, if you want to speak about from bottom to top and taking and giving, that really strikes me to the point that Mr. McDermott made just a little bit earlier. So there's a requirement in this law that there's an expectation that states focus on unemployment benefits to recipients who are most likely to exhaust benefits without finding work. Who are those people? Those are people who don't have education, who don't have a GED, who don't have a high school education. But this law specifically states focus on those people, help them find work, help them acquire training, help them get their GED, help them acquire a high school education. Now, there was a mention earlier in this discussion that veterans were somehow negatively impacted by this training effort here in one of the job creating points. My question to both of you is, how are veterans affected in this legislation? Are they losing any benefits?
No, sir.
Could you just kind of expound on that just for a little bit?
Again, as this discussion has generally made the point, the legislation provides funds to states and then permits them to choose to spend the money otherwise, but if they pass no law, the money needs to be spent in exactly the same way as it would be under current law. So if you're a veteran who receives extended benefits today, just like every other person receiving extended benefits today, the legislation directs the states to use the money that is forward funded to them for the benefits that you're receiving today.
It's my understanding of the bill that if a state, for example, chose to forego paying, if they pass a state law and forego paying benefits to pay their unemployment insurance debt, then veterans who have been entitled to those emergency unemployment compensation benefits or extended benefits would not receive them.
This money is still spent within the unemployment insurance program. Is that not true, Ms.?
It is true, but to pay back the debt will not be of any benefit to veterans.
It will help in creating jobs, is my opinion. Thank you for your time, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Crowley is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to point out to my good friend, Mr. Reichert, I don't have I'm not a conspiratorist. I don't lie into that form of thinking. I think you're actually being pretty blatant about what you're trying to do. There's no conspiracy here. It's all written down. For over 100 days, our Republican colleagues in the House of Representatives we've heard nothing but tick-tock as we've awaited a jobs bill. And now they tell us they have a bill. It's even named the jobs bill. Well, the tick-tock has been replaced by a cuckoo clock because there's not a single job in the bill that you create, except for maybe the people who own the paper mills that made the paper on which you've printed the bill. Now, if you're gonna call a bill a jobs bill, you should at least create a job in the bill. And what is the great plan? What is your great plan in terms of helping the economy? Cutting off emergency unemployment benefits. I'm not sure how that's supposed to help create jobs or grow the economy, especially since economists have repeatedly shown that unemployment benefits help to stimulate the economy. But my Republican colleagues would end these benefits as we know it. Now, they say that states can choose to keep funding unemployment insurance on their own if they want to. Isn't that correct, Ms. Gilbert? I say my colleagues have said that states can continue to choose to fund unemployment insurance on their own if they choose to.
That's correct. The bill does permit that.
But some states are cutting even the standard 26 weeks of benefits. Do we really think that states are going to be able to shoulder the federal government's responsibility? That's too much burden for our states during these difficult times. Let's talk more about how this bill will impact the states. This bill would let states use their unemployment insurance dollars for various purposes as long as they are somehow related to employment and the Department of Labor approves. Is that correct, of the spending?
That's correct.
But 30 states, including my own home state of New York, are currently struggling just to support their current unemployment programs, the basic benefits. So if states start spending money on other purposes, that could leave them with even less money to provide even regular benefits. Forget the emergency benefits that nearly 300,000 New Yorkers are currently receiving. Is that not true as well?
I'm not sure if I understood your logic totally, but we are.
Well, if you're giving them the leeway to use this money for other purposes,
yes,
that could very well mean less money for the emergency benefits they're receiving.
Oh, absolutely, that is correct.
Now, I don't know how that will help the unemployed, who have been looking for work, who are trying to support their families on what comes to only 70% of the poverty line for a family of 4. But hey, I guess as long as we're using the buzzword of flexibility, anything goes. Let me also ask, how else could this bill weaken the traditional unemployment insurance benefits that states pay out? Could states get a waiver that lets them just give a person some other amount or form of payment, like a fixed amount of payment, instead of the reliable weekly benefit they need for a family?
It's my understanding that that could happen under this if the Secretary were to provide the waiver.
The current unemployment insurance program is a promise to workers that if they lose a job through no fault of their own, their families will not go hungry. The bill before us today would revoke that promise, opening the door for valuable funds to be diverted to purposes that may help with unemployment but can very well end up hurting the unemployed. That's not a chance we should be willing to take with the livelihoods of our constituents. I know I'm not. This is a federal program that Congress has consistently voted to extend in order to help those out of work through no fault of their own. Many of my colleagues on this committee, as was pointed out, voted for the law that extended these benefits through the end of the year. And now they want to cut short that promise. You might remember this law as the one that also extended the tax cuts for the richest Americans. As long as my colleagues on this side of the aisle are looking to break one promise, maybe they should also cut short the extension of those tax cuts as well. At the same time, our Republican colleagues have cut job training programs, assistance to dislocated workers, and job creation programs like the TANF emergency funds for states to use. How are these cuts helping workers? I suppose just like this bill does, it only helps them know who is on their side and who is not. This is not a jobs bill. I guess we will continue the tick-tock of waiting for a true jobs bill, but in the meantime, this bill is simply cuckoo. I yield back.
All right, Mr. Herger is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This discussions that we've been going over have been very discouraging to me. I believe this is a jobs bill. We're going through a very serious time in our nation's history. Both my parents are deceased, but I grew up hearing about the decade-long of the Great Depression. This is the worst economic downturn we've had since that time, but it's certainly not the first recession we have. This is our 10th recession. We know we go through economic difficult times. We also know that these difficult times affect states in different ways. My friend from North Dakota, his state is experiencing unemployment that's only in the 3% area. My state of California is over 12. My colleague from Nevada is 13. Mr. Whitinger, the legislation that we have before us, does it allow each state to determine themselves how they're going to use this money?
That's correct. The default is that the states must use the money to continue to pay benefits that are payable under current law, so the current federal extended benefits. However, if the state passes a law after enactment, legislature, governor signing, then they can choose to use the money in different ways, but again, within the bounds of the UI system, along the discussion.
And the point is that to hear some of the discussion, we would think that each governor, and it was alluded to earlier in this markup, that they alluded to three Republican governors, but isn't it true a governor by themselves, whether they be Democrat or Republican, cannot unilaterally decide to use this legislation? Is that
That's
correct?
The law, or the bill specifically refers to a law enacted by the state legislature.
So in other words, we're talking about the duly elected legislatures of each of these states, whether it be North Dakota, Nevada, or California. They would determine what they felt would be best for their state. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And isn't it true that depending on the amount of education you have, those with less education are having a much more difficult time finding work than those who, say, have a college degree?
That's correct. The Department of Labor issues monthly data about unemployment rates by education level. The current unemployment rate for individuals without a high school degree is approaching 15%, which is well above the national average of 9%.
Which is 50%. Those without a high school degree have a 50% higher unemployment rate than those who have a high school degree or more.
That's correct, and that is only among those who are actually in the labor force and who have actually not dropped out. As I quoted before from a study, there are a significant number of people who have actually dropped out of the labor force and are not counted as part of that unemployment rate.
So this legislation actually allows states to help out those who are most in need, that while they're under unemployment, that they can help them secure a GED if they're able to. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Which in turn would put them in that category of having a 50% higher, or at least they wouldn't be in that 50% greater, correct?
Correct.
So I think this could be looked at as a jobs bill. I think very definitely this legislation before us is legislation that during an incredibly serious economic downturn that we're allowing states and elected legislatures to determine what they think is going to best help their citizens. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
I thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. I believe everyone who has been seeking recognition has had recognition. So there being no further questions, as I mentioned in my opening statement, I know that Mr. Davis has an amendment that he wishes to offer. I recognize Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
For the purposes of offering an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman will suspend while the amendment is distributed.
Thanks.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment makes a simple conforming amendment change in Section 203 of the bill, specifically amending the savings provision at the end by making an additional needed reference to Section 2005A of Public Law 111-5. Mr. Camp mentioned my amendment in his opening statement, and we've discussed it with the Democrat staff as well. They agree that this amendment is needed, and I hope to have everyone's support on it. The intent of my amendment is simply to make sure that states that currently operate the Federal Extended Benefit Program can continue to operate that program as it is today without having to change their state law. To be clear, this involves only the Federal Unemployment Benefit Program that provides up to 20 weeks of benefits today. For the remainder of this year, that program has been expanded to provide 100% federal funding instead of 50% and to allow states to use what is called a 3-year look-back instead of the 2-year look-back normally used to determine whether the state's current unemployment rate is high enough to qualify for benefits. About half of the states have passed laws that say, in effect, that their state will operate this program only while those temporary federal laws are in effect. But the Jobs Act both provides states all the federal funds associated with those temporary expansions in Section 201, and then ends those expansions to ensure the bill does not add to the deficit in Section 203. This has created concerns that states with state laws that say this program will operate only so long as those temporary expansions are in place may be forced to end the program prematurely. That's not the intent of our bill, and the Chairman's amendment added a needed savings provision to clarify that. But in so doing, it made the needed fix only for one of the temporary expansions, the 3-year look back, but not for the other, the 100% federal funding. My amendment fixes this unintended omission, making clear that states whose state laws say the extended benefits program will operate as long as 100% federal funding is provided will continue to operate those programs after the enactment of this bill. That's completely consistent with the intent of our bill, which is to provide states forward funding of the remaining federal unemployment funds, and if they do nothing else, expect states to continue to provide benefits that are payable today. I yield back.
Thank you. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Chairman,
Mr. Doggett's recognized.
I believe Mr. Davis has accurately described the amendment. This bad idea was rushed out so quickly that it has a technical flaw, more than one technical flaw. This allows the correction of that technical flaw that will get it closer to the bill as it was first described to us last Thursday. While the source of this bill, the individual or group responsible for it, still remains unclear, I think they should be permitted to make this technical correction, and as such, I have no objection to the amendment.
Mr. Levin's recognized.
I agree with Mr. Doggett. I just want to indicate what is likely at stake in this legislation, why this amendment was necessary. Many of the states have triggers relating to the extended benefit program requiring 100% federal funding for it to operate. If this bill becomes law, it's the likely death knell of the emergency unemployment program. We have struggled to extend it because of this unprecedented number of long-term unemployed. We have struggled. We were able to continue it as part of the agreement last December. And now to pass this even through this committee sends a signal, if the majority here is unwilling to act as they acted some months ago. I think the implication is that there will be no support for extending the emergency program. And what makes it even more worrisome relates to the extended benefit program, because states have relied on federal funding to continue that program. And now with some states reducing the basic state program from 26 to 20 weeks. Essentially, what this does is set a deeply worrisome signal to the unemployed of this country. No matter how hard you look for a job, you're essentially and your family on their own. So we need to pass this amendment, but to understand the potential dangerous, I think pernicious implications. I yield back.
As no further members seek recognition, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Kentucky. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Are there further amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentleman will suspend.
I'll reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. The gentleman will suspend while the amendment is distributed.
Since it's brief, Mr. Chairman, may I proceed?
Having seen the amendment, it's brief. I would recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment recognizes that our Republican colleagues are much better at naming bills than what they put in the bills. And so it leaves the name of the bill, but it strikes the remainder. As such, it will do for creating jobs exactly what the bill as introduced does, which is absolutely nothing, but it will save substantial paper. Mr. Chairman, this underlying bill is really the big shift bill. It shifts from the Republican position in December, a position that I strongly opposed, that in return for 2 years of tax relief for billionaires, the long-term unemployed would receive relief for a year, and now after 5 months, they've decided we'll take care of the billionaires, but we don't care so much about the unemployed. It also has as its underlying theme the shiftless unemployed, that we will shift this money that has been allocated to deal with the needs of the long-term unemployed from the shiftless unemployed to the states who have failed to manage their own budgets and plan for the future, that's a better use of the money. Well, I think that in discussions of both Democrats and Republicans today, our eyes sometimes tend to gloss over when we talk about 4 million long-term unemployed who are affected. We talk about $31 billion, again, to get the number correct, of money. Let me talk about one individual that has been impacted by the long-term, the extended unemployment benefits. And I set the stage for you, not in Michigan or Ohio that have had such high unemployment, but in Austin, Texas, which is one of the best areas in the country. In fact, Austin was identified, I think, by one private source as the community that had come out of the recession the best of any place in the country, and its unemployment rate last month was a little over 6%. I'm speaking specifically of Ann Danish. Ann is 57 years old, and until a short time ago, she was the vice president for operations of an Austin company. It borrowed too much, and when the economy tanked, her company tanked too. It closed its door, and 88 people in the Austin area were without any job. She contacted our office to learn what she could do about unemployment, and we explained to her what the benefits were. She says, the benefits kept my home together and kept me together. Without these benefits, a difficult situation would have become a disastrous situation. During the time that she has received extended unemployment benefits, Ann has applied in one of the best economies in the country for 118 jobs, including jobs in retail and other professions from that which she worked. She has gotten exactly 3 interviews out of those 118 job applications. 2 of those, the employers told her she was overqualified, and she has not been able to find other employment. We are talking about real-life human beings and the stories of these families. The extended unemployment benefits cannot take care of all their problems, but we can help a little those Americans who, through no fault of their own, have found themselves in a desperate situation. And there are a number of those out there. Now, one aspect that has not been discussed about this bill today is what it does not do. We know it doesn't do anything about creating jobs. But over the last 30 years, we have had a bipartisan commitment to extend the Federal Unemployment Tax Act to assure that we have the monies to keep our unemployment system working. Next month, that act will expire. There will be no more monies coming from it. It is quite clear that our Republican colleagues in this bill and in none other don't plan to extend it. Instead, their approach to federal unemployment insurance, as our chairman has indicated, is essentially the same as the approach to Medicare. Let it wither on the vine. Let the financial underpinnings of the employment system, which have been in place through Republican and Democratic administrations since 1976, let those expire. When you combine that with what they're doing in ending the guarantee with this opt-out system, one can understand why our teachers, many of whom in a state with a cruel budget as Texas has, with schools closing and teachers being terminated, we'll be facing the unemployment lines. Wrote to the committee, and I would ask to make it a part of the record through the National Education Association that this bill really poses a serious problem for those who are teachers who have will now see these unemployment benefits no longer available and that in a fragile economy, as several people have pointed out, we're also removing one of the most effective forms of stimulus. For that reason, I urge adoption of the amendment to leave the name but strip the remainder.
Without objection on the admission to the record, I will just make a few comments on the amendment. It's one of the briefest amendments I've seen in my time on the committee. It's just one line. It would strike the entire bill, and obviously for that reason I would urge a no vote on the amendment. Are there any further members seeking recognition? The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. McDermott is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I was looking through the clips this morning, and in Seattle there was a bank called the Washington Mutual Bank. Its logo was Friend of the Family. They engaged in some behavior which could not be called anything but reckless. And ultimately, they failed and laid off 3,400 people. Now, I come from a state where on our unemployment, we're not here seeking any loan forgiveness because we've had our rate high, and Washington State hasn't borrowed any money from the federal government because we have always tried to deal with the countercyclical nature of unemployment benefits. But we have people in the state of Washington who have now exceeded all the benefits. These are people that used to make $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 a month working for a bank and can't find any jobs in the banking industry because the market is flooded with people from banks. And those benefits have been keeping them afloat. Now, I've had several forums in schools, in high schools in my district, for people coming in trying to protect themselves against foreclosure. And the foreclosure efforts by banks has been basically not to help anybody. So few people have been benefited by the programs we've had that these people who have now run out of benefits are managing to pay their mortgage on their unemployment benefits, and that's all. Now, if one thinks that the middle class in this country can continue to be a middle class person and not have some way to hold on to their home that they've paid for 12 or 15 or 20 years, because if middle class is anything, it's about owning a home, a place for your family to go to, and to teach your children the value of saving and all the rest. And this bill says we're going to give the option to governors as to whether they're going to continue those benefits for people like the 3,400 people in that bank that lost their jobs through absolutely no fault of their own. The profligate acts of their administrators of that bank led these people now to the brink of disaster. And what is being done with this bill is saying, well, sir or madam, good luck. We're going to pull the lifeline. We're going to cut the lifeline. We're not going to pull it back because we're going to give the money to your governor. And we now have had an amendment that says they can still have those benefits if the governor wants to keep them going and the legislature wants to keep them going, and they're not going to use the money to pay back the loans. They're going to give them to you. Or these legislatures and governors can say, tough luck to the middle class. This is an assault on the middle class. Taking away unemployment benefits is not people who haven't tried, or people who didn't work, or people who didn't save, or people who weren't careful. These people in Seattle have been using their 401ks. What was left of them, because all their 401k was invested in the bank. So they didn't even have their 401k to bail themselves out. And we're driving the final nail in their coffin. We're saying at the federal government level, we're going to give the governor flexibility and the state legislature to take it away. And my belief is that a democratic society cannot exist without a solid, strong middle class. And unemployment benefits are absolutely the sine qua non. Without them, you do not have a middle class in this country. This is a bad bill. The amendment is a great one, and I urge the adoption of the amendment.
Mr. Brady.
Mr. Chairman, I had originally raised a point of order against the amendment because my friend from Texas unwittingly identified the merits of this bill in his remarks, to the point that if we want Ann Danish to continue to struggle with the status quo, then let's stay with the status quo. But if we want to provide some hope for a job for the Ann Danishes of America, then we need to make some changes to provide a way for our states to create and find those jobs for workers like her. So for those purposes, I withdraw my point of order.
Point of order is withdrawn. Mr. Levins recognized on the amendment.
Well, Mr. Brady sparked, I want to be very brief. To talk about this as a message of hope is so irresponsible. For people, millions looking for work who can't find it, and saying we're giving the states the ability to withdraw your unemployment, that's a message of hope. It's shameful. And you want to change the status quo? Don't change it on the backs of the millions in this country who are looking for work, can't find it.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope that members will support this amendment, because if we want to make our program for hard-hit Americans work better, the way to do that is to continue to dedicate the money that we as Americans who have the good fortune to continue to work put into the system to help our fellow Americans who are looking for jobs and hoping to get back to work. Unfortunately, this legislation puts in jeopardy that program because it doesn't guarantee that states will all use that money that we as taxpayers contribute to the system back to helping Americans make it through those tough times as they search for a job. I think as I listen to all the questioning on the bill to Mr. Whitinger and Ms. Gilbert, that I tried to find a point where I could see where it says in this bill that the money that's taken from benefits for jobless Americans must be used to create a job in America. And nowhere did I hear that that would be the case, that this money that would be taken from benefits for jobless Americans would be used to create a job or must be used to create a job, which means that we probably then put at risk a chance for another American who, through no fault of his or her own, lost employment, will be provided with that guarantee that we're all working towards the day when he or she can be put back to work. As I think about it, and as we've seen through all the discussion, it appears that this particular legislation before us could lose American jobs. As has been stated, if a state decides to use the funds for something other than those unemployment benefits that most of those unemployed Americans would use to buy the food and pay for the shelter of a family, then you are taking a lot of money out of the economy that is used by currently working Americans to stay employed as well. And so that if states choose not to spend their money on the Emergency Unemployment Compensation Program or the Extended Benefits Program, then lo and behold, this so-called jobs bill could be exactly the opposite of that. And finally, it just seems that if we're going to try to get Americans back to work, the last thing we should do is blame American workers for their jobless condition. And if this legislation simply says that states can do as they wish with the money, then at this stage I see very little protection that we're providing to Americans who have been spending months looking for a job to get back to work, and we are doing less to give them security at a time that they need it most. So at a time when we see seniors today being told that they're going to have to pay more for their Medicare, the last thing we should do is add upon that, telling American workers who've been hardest hit that now they won't be guaranteed that the money they dedicated to this program and other working Americans dedicate to this program for jobless benefits will now be put at risk as well through this legislation. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and let's move forward and try to figure out how we help Americans get back to work versus jeopardize the programs for those who are hardest hit. Yield back.
Unless further members seek recognition, I'm prepared to recognize Mr. Doggett to close. Mr. Doggett's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for giving us an opportunity to discuss our objections. I believe that they've been adequately raised regarding this surprise attack on the jobless. I will not be asking for a recorded vote on the amendment, but at an appropriate time would seek a recorded vote on the base bill. All right. Thank you.
The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. If there are no further amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. 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 Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Herger for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 1745 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
In
Mr.
the opinion
Chairman,
of the chair, the ayes have it.
we request a recorded vote.
The motion is agreed to. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Herger? Aye. Mr. Herger, yeah. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Brady? Aye. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan? Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Nunez? Aye. Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Davis? Aye. Mr. Davis, aye. Mr. Reichert? Aye. Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Aye. Mr. Roscom? Aye. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach? Aye. Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price? Aye. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith? Aye. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock? Aye. Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Aye. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Aye. Mr. Marchant, aye. Mr. Berg? Aye. Mr. Berg, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel?
No.
Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. Stark?
No.
Mr. Stark, no. Mr. McDermott? No. Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis?
Where's John today?
Mr. Lee? Or Mr. Neal, sorry.
Neil. Mr. Lee's gone.
Sorry. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra?
Mix you two guys up.
Mr. Doggett?
No.
Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer?
Yeah.
Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Ms. Berkeley? Ms. Berkeley, no. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Johnson? Chairman Camp?
Aye. The clerk will report the vote.
20 yeas, 14 nays.
There being 20 ayes and 14 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 1745 as amended is ordered reported to the House of Representatives. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objections, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.